Best behavior.
Oh, didn't need a reminder.
Put it up on YouTube.
And last week.
There's a handful that sometimes watch on YouTube later on.
Very good.
Yeah.
Then I need royalties.
Robin has enough.
Very good. Well, then I tell you what, we'll begin with a word of prayer. The Lord,
And also with you.
Also with you.
God of mercy, we give you thanks and we give you praise for the beauty of your creation this evening, for the rain that we've had over the past week or so as well that continues to water the earth and make things grow. Lord, we give you thanks for the gift of your word that you placed before us again this evening in the book of Romans. We pray that as we engage in conversation and dialogue about what Paul writes to the church and what Paul speaks to us, that your Holy Spirit would move in our hearts and in our minds as we learn and grow in relationship with you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So from last week, the one thing that I wanted to just touch briefly on, I know we talked a little bit about wrath and talked about that. I found a couple of quotes, because one of the things, as I was looking through, in the Gospels, you don't always hear a whole lot about wrath. We actually hear more about God's wrath probably in Paul's letters than we do in the Gospels themselves. But there was one particular place I was reading online that said, you know, you can find it in both places. You can find gospel in Old Testament and New Testament as well. And there were two kind of headings or quotes that I kind of liked that this particular author used about God's wrath. And he said, God's wrath is God's love in action against sin. And to me, what I took from that particular phrase was the notion that even when we think about the Old Testament, sometimes God's wrath is what God uses to bring us back into that better relationship, uses that to help us repent and turn back to him. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's the child correction, you know, the however you choose to do the corrective stuff of child rearing. Yeah, I think it's similar to that. You know, in my house growing up, it was a wooden spoon until my mom used it on my brother one time and it snapped in half, and then he turned and laughed at her. He never used that one again. that method stopped at that point in time. But I think she should have just gotten a thicker spoon, but you know. And then the other, at least for my brother, yeah, at least for my brother. But then the other quote that I found that I really liked is, it said, God's wrath is satisfied in Christ. And part of what I liked about that is the fact that I think when we think about God's wrath and that corrective nature, it was all about, if it's all about bringing us back into a right relationship, when Jesus came, that's exactly what he came to do. So last week when we were talking about the fact that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, we have that notion that Jesus satisfies the law on our behalf. So I think in many ways, that's also why we don't get as much or the same kind of language of wrath in the New Testament that we do in the Old. So whether you find those helpful or not, those, as I was thinking about it, those are just two language pieces and quotes that I found to be helpful in framing that conversation. So I don't know if there's any other questions or things from last time. If not, we'll jump back into the next section. Yeah, Joy.
For me, it was interesting. It reminded me of Mom saying, "You just wait till your father gets home." And the Old Testament going, "You just wait till you know, till this happens." It's like, watch out. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
It's also a comfort level if you get upset about something and you're doing it because you believe that you should. But other people don't feel that way, even as Christians. If you get upset and you speak your mind because you believe you should, God understands. You might feel guilty for lashing out at a Christian because of what you said, and yet you feel good about it.
Right. Well, and you know, I mean, you get the notion where, you know, Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no other," which is the notion of, this is what I firmly believe God is telling me. This is what I firmly believe God is leading me towards, and I can't do anything different than that in good conscience. Right. The other thing is that we've heard a couple of different places, even since we started the book of Romans, where the notion that God knows the heart. You know what I mean? So even in those moments, if we do end up maybe a little off base or a little wrong, we can trust in the fact that if our intention is, in my mind at least, if our intention is about serving God and being faithful to the best of our ability, yeah, we're going to get it wrong sometimes. But we trust that God knows the intentions of our hearts as well. And I think that's part of what we've heard in the book of Romans so far too. Any others before we jump into the readings for tonight? All right, well then we are going to tonight start with, we made it to chapter 3. We moved along pretty quickly last week. So we are going to jump into chapter 3, and we're going to read verse 9 through 20. I don't know if there's somebody who'd like to read that for us.
I don't mind.
Okay, go ahead, Joy. I'm going to move this a little closer to her. Let me, if you
Yeah.
can't hear her, just wave at me.
None is righteous. What then? Are we any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin, as it is written. There is no one who is righteous, not even one. There is no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who shows kindness. There is not even one. Their throats are opened graves. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no human being will be justified in his sight by deeds prescribed by the law, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin.
Thank you, Joy. So before we get into the kind of the normal, what jumps out at you, I want us to see about defining a word. And the word I would like for us to define is sin. If you were to come up with a definition for sin, how would you define it?
Turning away from God.
Turning away from God, okay. Wrongdoing.
Yeah.
I mean, I sometimes even think it's, sin is anything that removes you in some way or another, or puts a barrier between you and God. And one of the things is everybody might have a slightly different terminology, but usually it's something to have to do with not following what God wants us to do, right? I mean, that's a typical definition. So, and we also find that there's individual sin, right? Where there is the individual sin of an action or something that I do or something that I say. There is what we might call communal sin, which is more if a community is involved in something, that it becomes more of a community issue, and perhaps a community needs to be repentant of something that's going on. The other thing to remember, and this is the reason I bring this up, is because for Paul, I think we sometimes need to make the distinction between whether he's talking about a particular sin, the notion that sin exists, which for us we might refer to sometimes as original sin, right? That notion that sin came into the world when Adam and Eve sinned for the first time, when they ate the fruit. And because of that, we live in a world where sin exists and where our world is broken and imperfect. And that's not necessarily that kind of sin isn't the fault of any one person, where we say, oh, Forrest did something wrong, even though he probably did, I'm sure. But that's not one person's. That's original sin. That's Adam and Eve, and that's then created this this barrier and this imperfection in the creation that God made. So in my mind, those are at least, and you might even be able to come up with more, but in my mind, those are at least some of the definitions and thoughts around sin that I think we need to be aware of when we're looking at Paul, because there are times when he's talking about a specific sin. There are lots of times when he's talking about sin existing, which I think is more about the original sin in the world.
Well, we also confess about the sins that we don't do.
True, that's true. That, and there you'd be talking about a sin of, you talk about a lie of commission or omission, and I think the same is true of sin. There are sins where we are the ones doing something, and there are also sins, if we see somebody being hurt or abused or
We don't reach
that kind of thing. We don't reach out to help. Yeah, that's a sin of omission, I guess you could say, where we fail to act too. Yeah, which to me goes back to the one where if we say it's a matter of being in line with what God wants, and we don't do that. Sometimes it means we have to act. Sometimes it means we have to refrain from acting, depending on the situation. Yeah, but that's true, Forrest.
In the Lutheran Study Bible, right up there at the top, it says, sin for Paul is more than individual sins. It's also a power that overtakes people's lives. I thought that was pretty.
Yeah, if you didn't hear Joy, what she said is in Lutheran Study Bible, there's a note. It says, sin for Paul is more than individual sins. It is also a power that overtakes people's lives. And that, in my mind, would even be more the original sin. It's that pervasive thing that we find. It's in our world. And we do our best with God's help to fight it, but it's always there. It's always a presence that's seeking to draw us into the things that are wrong. Okay. So then let's go ahead and go with what strikes you. Are there things that are pique your interest or your curiosity, or you ask questions about when you hear them in that passage?
Verse 13, the throats are open,
And graves.
grave, and the user tongues to deceive.
Verse 13, yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is, most times when we're reading the New Testament and you have these little sections that are kind of indented, right? They're quotes from other places. This one is interesting, and Paul does this sometimes where it's kind of a linguistic thing. And what he'll do is it'll be basically a paraphrase of something. So all of these, as I started looking through, there are at least, if I remember correctly, I think 5 different psalms that are actually used in that section. And they're kind of all mashed together as one thing. But they're all basically put there because Paul wants to put a point together. Yeah. Were you going to say something, Lynn? No? Okay. All right. Once in a while I look up and somebody has a look on their face that looks like they're going to talk and I can't tell. So it's harder to read that online. But so that can happen, I think, for a couple of things too, or a couple of reasons. So sometimes it can be a quote that is an interesting quote because we have to remember that in Greek there is no such thing as quotation marks. In biblical Greek, there's really no such thing as a period at the end of a sentence. So Paul's writings, the sentences that get to be really long and awkward and hard to discern what they're saying, part of that is because in the original Greek, there's nothing to break up what comes where. And so sometimes in English, where we choose to put a comma or a period can make a very big difference, right? In English, but in Greek, it's just not there. So sometimes that gets thrown in there just because we need it in our English language. Like I said, it's not a quote from any one particular verse. It's about taking a bunch of verses, kind of putting them together because you're strengthening an argument, which is really what Paul's doing here. And what I would say is I went through and underlined something. So 9 times in a matter of verses 9 through 12, okay? So in a matter of 4 verses, Paul mentions this, what you might describe as kind of the universal nature of sin. Nobody is exempt, which we talked about that even last week at the beginning of the chapter, where it says all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. And then it says no one is righteous, not even one. No one has understanding. No one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they've become worthless. No one shows kindness, not even one. I mean, that's about as inclusive as you get. Not one, none of you, none, all. Like, yeah, 9 times in 4 verses. Now, the interesting thing for me is, as we'll see when we move into the next section in verse 21. So I think I mentioned this before. Paul's very, very typical style of writing is he will be pretty condemning. You know, he does his whole welcome, right? Greets people, does all of that stuff, tries to make a connection with whatever people he knew at that church. And then he pretty quickly moves into this indictment that says, you know this is wrong, you know this is wrong, you know this is wrong, you know this is wrong. Oh, by the way, you're guilty too. We've gotten all of that in the first, 2.5 chapters or so of Romans. And now we're getting ready to make the switch that he typically does, which is now turning a little bit more towards Christ and turning a little bit more towards righteousness and grace and how we come to receive and accept that through Jesus as a gift. So he's hitting it really hard. He's hitting it really hard here at the end to remind everybody, it's all of you. It doesn't matter whether you're Jew, doesn't matter whether you're Greek. All of us fall short. Not even one of us comes close. And that's really why even, their throats are open graves. Basically, in my mind, when I hear that, it's kind of like saying the things that you say are hollow, the things that you say are sinful, the things that you say aren't of God. Talks about they use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is under their lips, mouth full of cursing and bitterness. It's all about moving away from what God wants, whether it's of words or of actions. And I think even sometimes maybe saying that the actions are hollow. In verse 17, the way of peace they have not known. That people create conflict and that people even thrive on it sometimes instead of really seeking to walk in peace. That peace is foreign to them in a way. What do you make of verse 18? There is no fear of God before their eyes. What does it mean to fear God? I've heard other words used in place of fear at times.
My pastor growing up said you can replace the word fear with love.
Oh, that's not one I've heard before. I don't know whether you caught that. Did you catch what Forrest said? He said his pastor growing up said you could replace the word fear with love, which is interesting. I'd have to think about that one a little bit more, because the word that I typically have heard kind of replaced in, and sometimes you'll even find it in scripture, is kind of that there is no awe. You know what I mean? That feeling of awe in God's presence. Like if I were to rewrite that with that word, I would think it would say there is no awe in the presence of God before their eyes, or something like that.
No respect. They don't
Respect, I think, would work too. Yeah, there's the notion of, if you fear something, there is an acknowledgement of power, right? Whether it's good or whether it's bad. You can fear a tornado because you respect the storm and the destruction and the power that it has, the destruction it can bring. And so most people have a healthy fear or sense of awe for some of those natural disaster kinds of things. The notion of being in awe of God is the same thing. I don't know that the fear is always meant to be like trembling and cowering and turning away. I think it's more meant to be that notion of respect and acknowledgement and maybe even love, like you were talking about, Forrest. But acknowledgement that God is here and we're not.
I like the word acknowledgement, that they do not acknowledge God, nor do they care at all whether God cares about them or not. God's not a part of their life. He doesn't exist.
And I was just looking back, because we even had that at the end of chapter 1. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God. Yeah. So that notion of the fear of the Lord, and we have that in the baptismal liturgy, right? Where we talk about, I'm trying to come up with the language at the moment, but it talks about sustain them with the Holy Spirit, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. And again, I don't think that's the trembling kind of cowering in fear. I think that is the fear of the Lord is the acknowledgement, the respect of the Lord.
But are we saying that, the thought comes across my mind that back, you probably have to go back, I'm going to say 30 years
Okay.
and longer, where the man of the house, the head of the household, you feared your dad. You feared that if you did something wrong, and I gotta imagine that back when they were,
No.
there wasn't, you didn't spare the whip,
Sure.
I know Denny's talked about, you worried about going home and getting.
Oh, I mean, in my house, if you got in trouble at school, you didn't want to get in trouble in school, but it really had nothing to do with the principal. It had to do what was going to happen when you got home.
Yeah, but it was always for me from mom. Dad was never home. So,
No, right. Dad wasn't usually
Dad
home,
wasn't
but
home.
if it got to the if it was raised to a level where it came up again when Dad got home, that was not a good thing.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Well, I think the word in context does.
But
fit,
I think some
but
of
the other terms we used also. Fit.
Yeah. Well, and even some of that fear is still acknowledging that whether it's dad or parent or mom or whoever is kind of the disciplinarian in the house, because that's
Disappointing
depending on
that.
the house, that fear of the parent, I think, is the same kind of thing. It's still that acknowledgement that there is someone there that has more authority, more power, and more say than you do as the child.
And can make you hurt.
And can do and can bring consequences. Yeah.
Other than a spoon.
That's right. Other than a spoon. Right. I mean, in all fairness, it was an old spoon that she used on my brother too. But
Pete, with the presentation? I mean, telling them essentially, you guys are.
oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What, isn't half the audience get up and walk away from this? I'm not listening to this nonsense.
Right.
You're
Well,
abusing
and
it.
that's and I think in many ways that's like Paul's way of indicting people is interesting, because he would typically write a thing that he would get them on board where they'd be saying, yeah, that's right, they're wrong, they're terrible, they're horrible, they're no good. Oh, wait, did he just say us too? And that's, he would kind of turn the tables that quickly, where in some ways they had, in my mind, linguistically, they almost had no defense, because they've almost, not only did he indict them, but in a way they've actually already indicted themselves and said, oh, you're right, that we were just cheering them on, and now we realize we're doing the same thing, and we understand why. But I have to I'm with you. I agree with you. I don't think his message would always be popular, for sure, because he's telling people, I mean, he's also telling the Jewish people that circumcision physically is not what's important. That would not have been a popular thing with Jewish Christians. He's telling all of them that none of you are good enough, and that's never well received. But it's the only way for him to get to the point to be able to redefine reliance on Christ, which is why hopefully I think if people would then read further on, they realize, oh, okay, he's saying this because if we rely too much on ourselves, we won't rely on Christ. But yeah, I think the initial knee-jerk reaction to some of his writings would have been pretty harsh in reaction. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? So is there any piece of this that sounds familiar to you? I mean, for me, the last couple verses sound familiar. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no human being will be justified in his sight by deeds prescribed by the law, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So, to me, part of the reason that sounds familiar is it comes up in the lectionary. So I know we hear it at least once every 3 years. The other thing for me is whether this exact passage is significant or memorable for us. To me, this is part of what Luther ends up drawing out of the book of Romans as he starts to develop his theology of salvation, right? Everyone is held accountable by law, and no one will be justified in his sight by deeds prescribed by the law. Basically saying, you can try to fulfill the law all you want to, and you will not be justified by doing that, right? through the law comes the knowledge of sin. And that's kind of, I think, where Luther goes back to the notion of works and, of grace. And where we need the law to point us toward the gospel, right? That gospel of grace. And so if the law, through the law comes the knowledge of sin, the law is what reminds us that we fall short, so that we turn to the gospel, which is the kind of the pivot that he's about to make going into verse 21. So we have to also keep in mind this Romans is actually filled with a lot of stuff that was pivotal for it was a pivotal book for him in developing his theology, especially in relation to salvation, grace through faith. Yeah. All right, I'll tell you what. Any other questions? If not, we'll move into verse 21 through the end of the chapter. Would someone like to read that for us? Chapter 3, 21 through 31, through the end of the chapter.
Sure.
All right, go ahead, Chris.
But now, apart from law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed, and it is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and that he justifies the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of boasting? It is excluded. By what law? By that of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that a person is justified by faith, apart from works prescribed by the law. Or is it God, the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. Since God is one, and he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faith, and the uncircumcised through that same faith. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law.
Okay. So, thoughts or questions as we move into this?
I don't understand. What's he referring to then when he says, where then is boasting? Is that because the Christians were sitting there saying, hey, we're saved, and that was their boast that he's talking about?
Well, I think there's something to that. I mean, there's a number of different things that he's probably speaking to, and I don't know if it's exclusive of one or the other. I think one could be the notion that there's still the division between Jewish and Gentile Christians, and the notion that the Jews thought they were better than the Gentiles. But I do think it's also the notion of, it talks about the law, because it says, then what becomes of boasting? It is excluded. By what law? By that of works? No, but by the law of faith. In my mind, this still goes a little bit back to the notion of where we were in the last verses, which says, none of you are good enough. So don't hold something that you think you fulfill the law better than somebody else does. That doesn't mean you're better than anybody else. Boasting is excluded. Boasting is not part of our faith.
I kind of see it as
Go ahead, Deb.
thinking that what I'm doing makes me better than you and puts me higher than you.
Right.
So he's saying it is excluded. I'm not following the lines on this.
So, and maybe it's the word excluded.
I read it as, Forrest, I read it as like, that's not what's going to get you your salvation. Like, my good works, and no matter how much I talk about it, that's not what's going to get me there. It's my faith. I don't know.
Right.
It's my faith that's going to get it.
I mean, in some ways, you know, what becomes of boasting, I think it's even instead of saying it is excluded, you could almost say it is irrelevant. Boasting's irrelevant because it means nothing. You don't, whatever you think you have to boast of, it doesn't mean anything.
Okay.
It's probably like an awkward translation of something they would have said, like maybe an idiom or something.
Well, and sometimes I should have brought a couple other with me tonight, because sometimes if you look at NRSV and then you look at, I mean, does anybody else's translation have something a little different? I mean, that one was NRSV. Then what becomes of boasting? I don't know if anything says any different or not.
Mine says, well, mine is NIV. Mine says, where then is boasting?
Where then is boasting?
So,
Interesting.
I mean,
Yeah.
that all of a sudden it's like, well, where does this go?
Okay.
Bill, what
I'll
does
see.
yours say?
Well, mine was printed in,
It's verse 27.
yeah, I mean, it was printed, mine was printed in like 1812 or something.
It's closer to the time.
Yeah. It just,
Bill's still
He was
using
there.
Bill's still using the original Greek over here.
I bought it a year later, yeah. Where is boasting then?
Where is boasting then? Okay.
It is excluded. By what law?
Yeah, it's an awkward turn of phrase. I'll see if I can look into that one for next week. I don't have because I don't think I even have any notes on the side for that one. No, I
Unless
don't.
he goes back to 9 where he was talking, are we any better? Where it's one of these better things, which is boasting.
Well, and it is a little bit of his. So if you look at verse 9, you look at verse 27, and then you look at the very beginning. Or wait, where was the next one? Shoot. Yeah, actually, even then at the beginning of 4, what then are we to say was gained? So he kind of has these questions that keep coming up. And even going back to the beginning of 3, then what advantage has the Jew? Right? So he's kind of using this questioning technique in his writing here. That I think is, go ahead, Lois.
I have something, it's called The Message. It says,
Yeah.
our lives get in step with God and all others by letting him set the pace, not by proudly or anxiously trying to run the parade.
Okay. Well, because parade is kind of the for show. Yeah, and so it's not about boasting. It's not about the show. It's not about that kind of thing. It's about simply living your life of faith.
And where does that leave our proud Jewish claim of having a corner on God? Also counts. God is the God of outsiders, not Jews, as well as insider Jews.
Okay.
How could it be otherwise, since there is only one God? God sets right all who welcome his action and enter into it, both those who follow our religious system and those who have never heard of our religion.
So how many of you are familiar with it's actually a paraphrase of the Bible. It's called The Message. Have you heard of that one? So it's is it Eugene, what's the guy's? Peterson, Eugene Peterson. Yeah, it's some of them I find incredibly enlightening. That's one of those passages that I think actually sheds some good light on a few verses that are a little hard to figure out. There are other times where I don't find them as meaningful or comforting. Like if you take the 23rd Psalm in The Message, it's almost unrecognizable. Like it's just very, very different. It feels very different. And to me, it loses some of the poetry and that kind of thing that I look for in that psalm. But yeah, so it's what they call a paraphrase. It's not a direct translation, but he's trying to write it so that people can get the meaning a little bit better. Yeah, but thanks. I didn't know you brought that. Good. That's a good one.
There's no chapters.
Oh yeah. That's one of those. There's no chapter verses, so it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly where you are in it. It can be harder to use that for a Bible study. Yeah. Okay. So right at the very beginning, now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So, and maybe that's simplistic enough and everybody gets that. But part of what I want to point out there is the righteousness of God. The only way the righteousness of God was shown to people, righteousness was about having that right relationship with God that only came by keeping the law to its fullest in the Jewish tradition. And so what Paul is saying now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been shown to humanity in Jesus Christ. And even says, and it's been attested to in the law and the prophets, which basically part of what he's saying is, and if you go back in the Old Testament, you can even see those passages that draw attention and point people toward Jesus. So that's part of what he says, I think, in that verse like 21, 22. And then he does go back to that, all sin falls short of the glory of God. The other piece for me that I think is still always really important to highlight, even though it's pretty simplistically stated, it talks about in 23, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, they are now justified by his grace as a gift. And what I like about that, what I think is important for us to remember about that, is that justification comes as a gift from Christ, and it's not something that we earn, right? And that goes back to the works kind of stuff. It's a matter of you could say, do we choose to accept the gift that God has given us in Jesus Christ? And because we have the gift of free will, I do still think that people have the choice to say, no, I don't want that gift. I don't believe in that gift. I don't accept it. But that God offers it to us as that free gift. For me, I think that's important to remember. So the language in verse 25, right? It talks about the gift. Grace is a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement. So in the Jewish tradition, there was a day called the Day of Atonement, right? It was the day when things were kind of made right with God. And there were sacrifices offered. All of those kinds of things happened. There was actually does anybody know where the term scapegoat comes from?
Yeah. When they would put all the sins of, I don't know, maybe the year, they would like put the sins on this goat, and then they would lead the goat out of the town. They would basically banish it. I mean, some people say they would throw it over a cliff, but it's just leading the goat, leading the sins out of the town.
Get the sins out of town. And that's how that was one of the ways in which the community was cleansed. But that's how you get the notion of a scapegoat. It's like the goat didn't do anything, and yet they put all the sins on this goat and let it wander out in the wilderness until either it dies or something kills it, right? I mean, that's basically what's going to happen to this goat. But that's where the notion of a scapegoat came from. Yeah. There's actually a really good, I like to use BibleProject.com sometimes. I've used it with the middle schoolers in confirmation quite a bit. They have some wonderful videos. And so for a book like Leviticus, right, Leviticus is a rough book. If you try to just read the book of Leviticus, if you can get through that, you're probably good to get through the rest of the Old Testament. But they actually do a really good job of kind of describing that scapegoat thing within the book of Leviticus and how that was part of the law and what happened. That's one of the places I've seen that best explained. So, but the reason I say that is because when it talks about Jesus' blood for atonement, I mean, that's the notion that we're going with. It's a matter of Jesus' life. Jesus' blood offers that atonement for us. It's what puts us back into that right relationship with God. And sometimes even in this instance, they're even using the language from the Jewish tradition to correlate Jesus to the one who brings that atonement to us and for us. Does that make sense? I'm trying to.
So essentially, Christ was our scapegoat.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. Christ is the one that we put all of our sin on him. And he, or I should say, he willingly took it for us.
Right.
That might be the only difference, Lee. is the fact that the scapegoat had it done to him. Jesus chose that for the sake of his people. That might be the distinction. Were you going to say something, Marlon?
Yeah, I'm using the Living Bible, and at the end of this verse 25, he said he used Christ's blood and our faith as a means of saving us from his wrath. We're back to it used the word wrath
Oh.
again.
Okay, and mine says he passed over the sins previously committed. Okay, interesting.
But going back to connecting where you started this evening, talk about
Yeah.
Well,
The wrath.
mine has a footnote where he was reading there, that atonement. Okay, he said God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement. And then there's a footnote that says, or as the one who would turn aside his wrath, taking away sin.
Turn aside. Okay, so Jesus is the one who causes God to turn aside his wrath.
Yeah, the second part of this, I don't quite understand it says in this way he was being entirely fair. Okay, about the wrath again.
Okay.
It says, even though he did not punish those who sinned in former times, I thought they were punished. Right now I'm reading Ezekiel. I just got out of Nehemiah and Jeremiah.
Okay.
They're punished all the time. I don't
Right.
I can't equate that.
Yeah,
It
I'm not.
says he's looking forward to the time when Christ would come and take away those sins. But I mean, I guess maybe I'm saying he physically punished them, but not spiritually. I don't know how to.
Which verse are you looking at, Marlon? Is that still like
all in 25?
It's all 25. Okay.
Yeah, in this way he was being entirely fair, even though he did not punish those who sinned in former times, because he was looking forward to the time when Christ would come and take away those sins. And that's where it ends.
So one of the other interesting linguistical pieces that's in mine is partway through 25. It says, he did this to show his righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over the sins previously committed. And I'll be honest with you, the passed over the sins previously committed, like to me, I automatically go back to the Passover too, like with some of that language, freeing the people kind of, he had passed over some of the things that they had done to bring them back into a right relationship in the right place. Wow. Okay. There might be a lot more in that passage than I was originally thinking. More questions about that. I might be leaving with more questions than I had when we started. Okay. Other thoughts or questions? I'll do a little bit more looking on that verse 25 into 26 too. Bless you, Steve.
Bless you.
Anybody want to learn a little Hebrew tonight?
Sure.
Do you know how to say God bless you in Hebrew? Baruch atah Adonai. Means God bless. Adonai is God.
Oh, no.
Bless you is Baruch atah. You got to get the Baruch atah Adonai. Or if you ask Elena, I was taking Hebrew when Elena was little. She was like 6 months old. So before she ever learned how to say bless you when somebody sneezed, we taught her how to say Baruch atah, or we tried to get her to say that. And so when she was little and somebody would sneeze, the first thing she would say was Brutata. It was a lot of fun. The things only church geeks do. No. All right. So what then do you make of verse 31? At the end of all of this, it talks about God is the God of the Jews. He's the God of the Gentiles, all of this stuff. And mine says in verse 30, since God is one, and he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faith and the uncircumcised through the same faith, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. What is he saying?
Follow.
He's saying follow the law.
Because wasn't there, what book was it where he says, well, it doesn't just mean that, we can just do whatever we want and,
Right. I have to go back and find the correct citation and exactly where it is, but there's the notion that, like, if this causes this little one to sin, then by all means don't do it. But it's the notion of saying the law is still important, right? The law is still important. What God tells us to do is important, even if, as we've all been saying, it's not a matter of boasting. It's not a matter of our own accomplishments. It's a matter of something else. In my mind, and it doesn't say it here, but in my mind, the reason that we keep the law, and I think we talked about this maybe 2 weeks ago or something, was the notion of how it's our response, right? It's how we respond to the grace, the gift of grace that God has given us in Jesus Christ. And so the way we respond doesn't gain us salvation, but our response is still important because it is the most basic expression of our faith that we have. Other ways to hear that or think about it?
But how would you define the difference between trust and faith? Because it's using both in this passage.
Trust and faith.
Yeah, mine says, in fact, only when we trust Jesus will we truly obey him, but we're also to have faith. So what's the difference between faith and trust? Is there already?
I'd be curious to hear what folks think. I'm not sure I've ever been posed that question or thought about what the difference between those two words would be.
I would think maybe trust is something that is bestowed upon you. Like, so with Jesus, if you're saying like trust in Jesus, you're kind of removing yourself from that, where faith is an action thing for us. I'm doing a bad job of explaining it. Like, for faith, for me, is faith in action. Whereas when I'm trusting someone, I am being vulnerable for that person. So it's not something that I need to do. It's almost like when I'm trusting in Jesus, I am letting go of anything that I could let stand in the way. Or when I say here faith, it's something that I need to now do because of that trust.
Am I showing my faith by my trust in Jesus? Is that expression of my faith is trust?
I mean, there's a part of me that says, I think faith is bigger than trust. And to be honest, I'm just trying to start putting words to this, so it's not going to come out well. But I think trust is a piece of our faith. You know what I mean? But faith is bigger than just trusting. Cause I might have to play around with the definite, like I might actually try to do some writing and put some words to that for next week, Marlon, because I like that question.
Well, we have that old song that says, trust and obey, or there is no other way. Remember that one?
I don't remember that one, but
we used to sing that one.
Oh yeah.
Lois is shaking her head though.
Yeah.
It's probably in that old Sunday school book.
We probably have about 30 or 40 copies in the archive room, I bet.
We need to dust those off and use them.
Amen.
Well, there's no.
I will say for me, trust is.
Go ahead.
Trust for me is like I physically know that person. Faith is like more of an abstract thing. Like I trust my parents. I grew up with them. I've experienced experiences with them. When my dad says, put your money in this, I'm like, I gotcha. I know it because he hasn't let me down. So I trust him. But faith is sort of more of an abstract thing. I don't know if that's right or not, but that's in my head what I'm thinking.
I think especially when we think about trusting, especially other people, that trust typically is something that we trust because there's a good track record. or at somebody that you know cares about you, that kind of thing, where faith is, yeah, I mean, I guess I get what you're saying. It might be a little bit more of that abstract piece where sometimes I think we also get in trouble because we use the word faith in different ways, right? We have faith in God, but we also might say, oh, I have faith in my daughter to make the right decision, when maybe the more accurate phrase would be, I trust my
Trust,
daughter
right.
to make the right decision.
Yeah.
Where
I would say
faith might
trust
not
in
be the
that.
right word. Yeah, but I think we use that word faith that way sometimes, where that might muddy the waters when we try to define those or use them. Bill was saying something here a second ago
I
too.
thought they were close to synonyms. I don't think, you have to justify either one. Right?
Well-
If you say, I trust you, that's because you don't have to justify that.
No, I
have
agree.
faith in you, you don't justify that.
Okay.
Right?
To-
So
to-
Well, and sometimes maybe it's earned, but I'll also be on, like, for me, and maybe I think this is also a difference in society where we are anymore. Like, I think for the most part, people were willing to just trust people and take them at their word from the very get-go, the first time you met somebody. I don't think that's as true in our society anymore.
Right.
Where now, you're right. I think it is more one of those things, if I have faith in you or I have trust in you, it's more so because of the shared experiences that we've had that I know that to be true.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm okay with both words. That doesn't.
The
So
word that's
trust builds faith.
going through my head, and it's like, you can't. To me, you can't interchange the word great as like trust, because faith is. Back to your point, faith seems bigger than trust.
Well, and I do think there's the notion of, like, when we talk about God's faithfulness, and this is why I guess when I think about the word faith, it's probably most accurately left to use that faith when we're talking about God, whether it's our faith in God or, frankly, God's faithfulness to us. And I guess in my mind, God's faithfulness is something that we have trust in.
Okay,
Yeah, I
so
did probably talk in circles too.
I'm in the concordance here
Okay.
because I'm a teacher.
I was gonna say leave it.
Okay, so trust says to place one's confidence in, to hope. Okay, faithful or faithfulness, loyal, worthy of trust, devotion. So even the concordance places faith a little bit higher.
Yeah, but they're clearly linked.
Linked.
I mean,
Yeah.
clearly linked to me. Yeah. Okay.
Also, it's the unknown. Trust, we don't know what's going to happen. What we're trusting in, we do not know, and faith is the same way. We have faith it'll happen, but
Yeah. Both of them have that. What if you couldn't hear Lois? Part of that is they both have an element of the unseen. Whether you're talking about faith for the future or trusting in something in the future, it's a little bit of it is the unknown. There's expectation and anticipation there. Yeah.
Could you say, because we have faith in God, we trust God?
I think so. Yep, I think so. Well, I'll tell you what, folks. Instead of jumping into chapter 4, I think what we're going to do is we'll call it a night there. So I'm going to go ahead and log us off for the recording, and then we'll close in prayer. So don't hop off don't go anywhere. Just